Shalom. Good evening. Is this on? Yeah. No? Does it seem like it's on? Okay. Shalom and good evening. If we haven't met yet, I'm Rabbi Julie Danan, and welcome to our talk this evening from Rabbi Simcha Daniel Burstyn. And hi to everybody on Zoom. There's a lot of people on Zoom. Hello to you, and hi to everyone in the room. So I'm really blessed to know Rabbi Simcha Daniel as a colleague, fellow Aleph ordinee, and from the Aleph rabbinic program, but he also has additional ordinations as a mashpia, which is a spiritual director, and a dayan, a halachic expert or judge. And you all know him, and also on a personal note, our daughter was participated in the Green Apprenticeship at his kibbutz, a permaculture program. And many of you already know Rabbi Simcha Daniel because he was High Holiday leader here for a while, and people are glad to have you back. He's been a member of Kibbutz Lotan since 1990. The kibbutz is an eco-Jewish intentional collective community in the Arava Valley in Israel. Rabbi Simcha Daniel splits his time between physical and spiritual service, teaching at their Center for Creative Ecology. And I know that a lot of people here on the trip to Israel, did go to visit the kibbutz. In addition to Ohala, our Jewish renewal rabbinic organization, Rabbi Simcha Daniel is an active member of Rabbis for Human Rights and the Israeli Reform Rabbinical Association, and actually it's the CCAR convention, the Reform Rabbis Convention, that brought him to Philadelphia. As regional rabbi for the Israeli Reform Movement, he teaches youth and adults in the kibbutz and in the Arava region, with a special focus on Judaism and ecology and the mitzvot of the land of Israel. So I'm very appreciative that Rabbi Simcha Daniel already spoke to our community on Zoom after the terrible events of October 7th, and you can find his first talk on our YouTube channel. We'll be recording tonight's talk for people that didn't get to see it or people that want to see it again. So we're so glad that your meeting brought you here, and we're so glad you agreed to come here, and we'll be hearing you speak about community, trauma, and the fragility of hope, an update from Israel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Julie. It's really nice to see everybody who's here, and nice to see it would be nice to see the people who are on Zoom. I took a glance at the monitor back there where Howie is sitting, but I do want to invite you to move up if you want, if you would be so kind, those of you who are here in the room. So as Julie said to introduce me, the title that I've been working with is Community Trauma and the Fragility of Hope. And so I'm trying to think of a way to frame a conversation about what it means to be Jewish in 2024. And what it means to be in a place that most of us in our generation, your generation, my generation, maybe my parents' generation, thank God my parents are 94 and 95, they are maybe have some memory from childhood of a time when it was not so safe to be Jewish. And that Jewish was something maybe that you didn't wear outside. And now, up until now, we've been living loud and proud Jewish lives, and maybe that's changing again. And I don't even know I'm not sure what to do with that. And I'm sure that whatever I say, I'm not right, you know? And just because I have some thoughts about it doesn't mean that they are the only thoughts that could be. And I want to give you plenty of space and room to be to express your thoughts as well. But I did want to begin by connecting us to a little bit of Torah. This week we're reading Parashat Pekudei. Parashat Pekudei is the last parsha in the book of Exodus, and when we finish reading, we're going to sing Chazak Chazak V'nitchazek, which we sing every time we finish a book, reading a book of the Torah, before we move on to the next reading. And that means, we often translate that as may we be strong, or may we strengthen each other. As we are living in the Jewish cycle of things, this is a time of year when we're looking forward to feeling, we have a number of events coming up, let's say, that are going to make us feel more stronger in our Jewish identity and stronger in our community. We're going to be coming together. I imagine you're coming together for Purim in just a week and a half, and a month after that we have Pesach. We had a little extra month of winter this year, or at least an extra month between events. I always think of that when it's a leap year. I think, wow, I have a month off, or a month to do something more special, and take that time to focus in on a specific project. So this week's Torah portion gives us the final assembly of the Mishkan. It's kind of strange that we have these, there's like detailed lists of all the parts and who brought what and how much did they bring. And we're building this fragile tent that's going to become the home of God for the community during the Israelites' 40-year journey in the wilderness. Now, we often think, maybe here in North America, that the time that you need to be concerned about protection is the winter. Maybe not here in Delaware, but in North America, with the wonderful winters that didn't happen this year, my sister in Wisconsin tells me. But in the land of Israel, and especially in the desert, the summer is really the time we need to worry about. I'll get back to that in a second. I want to say one more thing. I've been on this bima before with this beautiful ark behind me, but this building is amazing. And it's so exciting to be here, because I was here when you were having meetings about starting the project, and the last time I was here was High Holidays in 2019. And it goes right along with this theme of the building of Mishkan, right? You built a Mishkan. This building is a Mishkan. But the Mishkan is not just the building, it's also the communal structures. And constructing and maintaining community, just like a building, it's the challenging jobs. And we can only imagine the challenges that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam encountered, and the whole community really encountered on the journey from slavery to freedom. We read the whole Torah over the course of a year, and the story of the Exodus takes 9 months of that, 40 weeks. I don't think that's a mistake. I think that's very intentional, like a pregnancy, right? This morning, my daughter told me that she's pregnant with what, God willing, will be our first grandchild, so that's exciting. And this year is, as I said, it's a leap year, and we call that in Hebrew Shana Me'uberet, and that means a pregnant year. So you built this wonderful building, and as I was being shown around, I also saw downstairs there's a safe room, But the tent in the wilderness is not that at all, right? It's a fragile tent. I mean, maybe it was a very fancy tent, right? It had these, like this kind of gold-walled building in the middle of it, right? But it was a tent. And hundreds of years later, King David famously complained to Nathan the prophet, "See, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God is sitting under a tarp." Essentially, that's my translation of the Hebrew. But God told the prophet that David wouldn't be the one to build the temple. He didn't think that the tent was honorable enough. He didn't think it was fancy enough for, he's the king, and he should have, right? Because God is even bigger than him, so God should have a bigger house than he does. But God says to Nathan to tell David, "From the day that I brought the people out of Israel out of Egypt to this day, I have not dwelt in a house, but I have moved about in tent and tabernacle. As I moved about wherever the Israelites went, did I ever reproach any of them, any of the tribal leaders whom I appointed to care for my people Israel? Why haven't you built me a house of cedar?" That's what the prophet comes to tell King David. God doesn't really need fancy trappings and stone buildings or the kind of material honors that we humans take for granted. Now, I just want you to hear the critique that the text is putting in the mouth of the prophet. We can say it was God, or we can say maybe it was some, sarcastic writer was putting it in there to like take a dig at the king. Maybe the king that they're taking a dig at isn't King David, but some later king, perhaps. A king who maybe is leading in a way that is a little bit less than respectable. I don't want to say more than that, but I do want you to be hearing that, right? And you can follow that on however you like. The tabernacle symbolizes for us the heart of the community, the social center, the spiritual center, the pole around which the community revolves. It's the place that keeps the community going, even as the Israelites move from place to place. So why am I talking about this? Because I live in a kibbutz. And a kibbutz is a community that we spend a lot of our money and our time together intentionally thinking about how are we maintaining the community. And that's a physical thing, and that's and it's also a social thing, and it's also a spiritual thing. And of the communities that were attacked on the 7th of October, many of them were kibbutzim. And that was intentional, that the kibbutzim were the frontline communities, because the kibbutz has the resilience as a community to spend more of its energy, of its let's say of its money, even of its people, of its people power, on defense. And in the kibbutzim, not all of them, but many of the kibbutzim on the Gaza border predate the establishment of the state. Some of them were established just after Yom Kippur in 1946, the so-called 11 points, where in one night the Haganah built 11 kibbutzim, 11 towns of which I think 10 are still existent kibbutzim along the Gaza border and around the city of Gaza to protect the rest of the country. And it's important to understand that. It's important to understand that also because today, 5 months after the war began, the kibbutzim are already moving back, but the people of Sderot are not moving back yet. The people of Sderot actually are moving back, but the people of the towns are less organized, right? I mean, that's the difference between a town, any town, and a kibbutz. In the town, the people keep their money to themselves, they pay taxes, and the town runs. In a kibbutz, people give their money to the kibbutz. It's like an HOA, but it's not an HOA. right? Because I know many of you live in communities where there's an HOA. A kibbutz is like that on steroids, right? Except for one thing, and that is that there's a lot more work that goes into doing the community work, doing the creating the community. We're not just all living in our houses and coming together twice a year for a Christmas party and a summer party, right? We're getting together and like you do here at Seaside, getting together at every holiday, getting together every Shabbat, getting together even on a Thursday night or Wednesday night just to hear a visitor from out of town speak. And it takes a lot to keep our communities going, right? Each of us needs a task in that. I just heard somebody saying to someone else, you have this task, and the response was, no, that's the committee's task. One of the things that I've seen, our kibbutz is small, and so we're like kind of on the edge of, are we just the people or are we the institution? And if you have that thing where it's the person and then that person suddenly no longer available, right, then it's a problem. And that's one of the lessons that we can learn, is to make sure that when we're thinking what does it take to keep the community going, that everybody is thinking that together and thinking about it together. This is one of the things that the kibbutz movement comes to teach us. 40 years ago, I want to say, the Israeli government took on the kibbutz movement, and there was a lot, there's definitely not good things to say, there's also bad things to say about the way that the early government of Israel solved its problems, and it absorbed a lot of new immigrants in a short amount of time with a kind of a social flattening, and people felt oppressed by that. It's important to understand that there's a lot of resistance, but 40 years that's been going on, and the kibbutz movement seemed to be completely out of the picture as a part of the Israeli scene. And then came the 7th of October, and we see that the kibbutzim are able to stand on their feet again much more quickly because of the investment that the members put into the community. And maybe this is a lesson that the whole Jewish people should be learning. So in the desert, they put the sacred implements in the center. They brought their gold, and they made all kinds of golden tools. And so we need to think, what are our holy vessels today? And we also need to think, what are the expectations that we put on leadership? The Parsha reads like an expense report. Moshe runs down the list of all the materials used, the order of the construction, as if to say, here's what you brought, here's the way we used it, and that's just what we would expect anyone else to do. It's not like the most amazing mystical Torah, although there's amazing mystical teachings connected to it that Julie and I were talking about earlier. But it provides a reflection on honesty and integrity that is absolutely essential for leadership. And I'm sorry to say that right now there's a big challenge regarding honesty and integrity in leadership. And prior to October 7th, for most of the past year, a large portion of Israeli society was out on the street every Saturday night protesting that lack of integrity. It's important for me to put that out there as well. David's complaint to the prophet shows us that integrity is not necessarily the coin of every leader. And we know from other stories that David was a flawed leader, and the rabbis make a big deal of this, that David was, right? We see David in all his human foibles, right? He's a warrior chieftain, and he comes to a farm and he likes the look of the wife of the farmer, and he finds a way to marry him. He's sitting in his palace in Jerusalem, and he looks down and he sees a beautiful woman bathing on the roof of her house, and he finds a way to get rid of her husband to take her as a wife as well. So maybe that's another reason God didn't want him to build a temple. And maybe God doesn't want us to have leaders who want to build temples to their own grandeur. We have to ask what happens when the center doesn't hold. My mother loves to quote the poem by Yeats. It's called The Second Coming. The things fall apart, the center cannot hold. That's the line that she's always quoting. What it made me think, my mother just celebrated her 95th birthday. So for her, you know, that's a poem from World War I. World War I was a watershed. She was a child at the beginning of World War II. So she was born in this time when, you know, in between the wars, and there were some mistakes made at the end of World War I by the French and the British, right? You know the story, they said we have to punish the enemy. Maybe that didn't work so well. So we might consider that in our regard as well. But this is definitely a watershed moment in all kinds of ways. So every year around this time, as I said, I'm going to come back to the issue of summer and get away from politics, because I don't want to talk too much about politics, because I don't want to do more than hint. Every year around this time, we read about this building of the Mishkan, the creation of the community, and it brings us important information. Summer is coming, right? That's, you know, the Game of Thrones, winter is coming, but for us, summer is coming. And summer is coming, that means it's going to be hot. Where I live, summer is a time of, you take the laundry out of the washing machine, you shake it, you hang it on the line. By the time you're finished with the load, you can start taking it off the line. It's that dry, okay? And this year is going to be hot everywhere because of the El Niño cycle. Now, what's the connection between community building and summer? What does the community provide for us in the summer? What's missing in summer? Well, maybe you need protection from the heat. Maybe you need protection from the sun. Maybe you need to have water stored up, because where I live, it rained on December 9th. It rained so much that the entrance to the kibbutz was flooded. But it hasn't rained since. And it might not rain for 3 or 4 years. Now we have wells, and we have pumps, and we have a national water system. But every community is in danger in the summer, in the desert. For us, the winter is a time of lushness, right? It's a time of food is plentiful, and the summer is a time of danger, time of dehydration, the danger of starvation. And as a community, we have the opportunity to work together to share our resources and survive the harsh, hot weather. We also need to work together to bring in the harvest, which will sustain us, right? And that's pretty much true in the entire Northern Hemisphere, and in the Southern Hemisphere too, but just the other time of year, right? And we don't always think about the food system, but the food system is global today. And that global system, if we don't think about it, then we might be missing something. Because if we're only thinking about how are we going to protect our people, we might be missing out on a big piece of how are we going to protect all the people. And that's the wisdom that's encoded in our sacred text. There's a line in the Proverbs that my friend Micha Livni, who's an elderly gentleman, I think he's 90 already. He's a member of Kibbutz Lotan, but he lives in Jerusalem because his wife is not a member of the kibbutz. He likes to quote this line from Proverbs, Be'ein chazon yipara am. Without vision, the people will become frayed. Frayed like a piece of fabric becomes frayed, right? And you can hear the similar sound, the word frayed, frayed with the PR, the FR, and the vowel at the end, like yipara. It's the same, in fact the same deep root. There's another meaning too. It could also be translated go crazy. Without vision, the people will go crazy. Without leadership that tells them what to do, without leadership that says, where are we going? What are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do the day after? And one of the great criticisms that we've been hearing a lot in all kinds of places is this issue of the day after. Well, every day is the day after. Okay, so let's see, I mentioned the kibbutz movement and the story. Okay, but the kibbutz movement, I'm going to read a little bit of this, even though I've already gone through it. The kibbutz movement began as a solution to a problem of lack. The members exchanged personal purchasing power, which wasn't worth much in Israel in the 1950s, but by the 70s was. But they exchanged that in exchange for a role, in exchange for having a task, in feeding the nation and creating a communal story. Foundational elements of traditional Jewish community, like mutual aid, care for elders and children, those were updated for the modern period by the kibbutz movement. The emphasis on creating a communal narrative provided the meaning, and while the kibbutz movement was never a big part of Israeli society, it provided a communal story for the entire nation. And for many years, and many of you are of a generation for whom, like the kibbutz, you heard Israel, you thought kibbutz. By the time I got to kibbutz, that was already probably not the case. And in any event, kibbutz was only about now it's maybe 5% of the Jewish population, but it never was very much. Okay, so let me tell you some specific things that are happening in my region. My region, just so you know, anybody who's not familiar, those of you who've been there know how far away we are from everything. We're 2.5 hours south. That might sound familiar. You're 2.5 hours south from some places that people think, oh, you're from Delaware, but you're not from there. Maybe it's not 2.5 hours anymore, maybe it's only 2 hours. And if you got a heavy foot, you could make it in 1 hour. But we're 2.5 hours south of the Gaza envelope of Beersheba, which is the geographic center of the country. We're almost at Eilat. And our region has been like a haven. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there were 60,000 internal refugees who came to the city of Eilat, and another 2,000 or 3,000 who came to the kibbutzim in the Arava. Okay, the winter population of Eilat, the general population in a regular year, is less than 50,000. And an additional 60,000 people came, living in hotels, living in empty apartments, living in the kibbutzim, and among them were members of some of the kibbutzim in that area, in the Gaza area. In my region, kibbutz Nir Yitzchak have settled and they're staying until the army says it's safe for them to go back to their kibbutz, which is 3 kilometers from the Gaza border, near the Gaza city of Khan Yunis. And they're staying in Kibbutz Elot, which has a hotel that's a little bit like a kibbutz, or a little bit like one of your communities that you have here, where it's like multi-story like two-story buildings with 2 apartments on each entrance, almost like a kibbutz. They're still their rooms. They're not apartments. So they're staying down by us, and they're staying at Kibbutz Elot. At Kibbutz Yotvata, they had members of Kibbutz Nirim living in the kibbutz, and they were going to be bringing in Kibbutz Kfar Aza, which was one of the worst attacked. And the people from Kfar Aza who were staying in a hotel in Eilat, they came to look at the buildings that the people at Yotvata had put together. They quickly cleared their teens out of the teenage living area, and prepared it, and cleaned everything, painted all the walls, whatever. And then the people came from Kfar Aza, and they said, no, we can't live here. This is exactly the same design building that where the worst part of the massacre happened on our kibbutz. So many of the kibbutzim have found other places to live. Kibbutz Nir Oz are in a set of new apartment buildings in Kiryat Gat. And Kibbutz Be'eri are in a bunch of different buildings in kibbutz in the middle of the city of Beersheba, and members of Kibbutz Kfar Aza are at Kibbutz Shfaim, which is near Herzliya, and they're living in the hotel there. So it's similar, and these communities. This is one of the advantages of these communities having a connection. Right? Because there's a movement, because the government has been doing very little. And that is really tragic. Now, what happens in Israel, we're kind of completely tied into the Jewish calendar, right? In a way that you're not tied into the Jewish calendar here. You always say, is Rosh Hashanah early this year or late, right? Because it's like, no, it's always on Aleph Tishrei, right? But it's, but our holidays, so Sukkot, the week of Sukkot, is a national holiday, the whole week. It's not that the stores aren't open, but the government offices aren't open. Even the army has is running on a skeleton staff. And that week, all these people were not on base and not in their offices. And the shock was so great that the government wasn't able to get themselves in gear to solve problems until 2 weeks, a month, even more than a month later. And as a result, the civil society picked up the slack. Well, that's great. Amazing that these protest organizations that had been protesting for 9 months beforehand were able to shift gears and become a civil, take over welfare roles. But at the same time, the people who are trying to dismantle the welfare state in Israel look at this and say, look how well they did. The civil society can take care of everything. And they're still, today, under the shadow of the war, cutting all kinds of programs that the majority population are shocked at. So thank God for the kibbutznikim have the tools and have the community and have the larger community to have solved their problems, but the majority of the people who were not injured but traumatized and had to leave their homes are not kibbutznikim, and they don't have those safety nets, and they don't have those communities, and they're in a lot of difficulty. And notice I haven't even spoken about the hostages yet. And what we talk a lot about October 7th, and we talk a lot about what's happened in Israel in the Gaza envelope, and we're not maybe paying attention to the northern border, where there are also 80,000 people who have been evacuated from their homes from Kiryat Shmona in the northeast, along the Lebanon border, all the way to Nahariya in the northwest, and that's and there's actually more danger there, I think, in the long run, but because it's not so, I don't know how to put it, you know, there wasn't a massacre there, thank God, but Kibbutz Manara, which is right on the border and a little bit kind of on the slope, like their water runs off into Lebanon, they've lost 60% of their housing because the Hezbollah are shooting there with anti-tank weapons, just kind of short range. They're just kind of, you know, doing target practice. When people ask me to talk about Zionism, I often tell them about an exchange of letters I once read. The playwright Stefan Zweig wrote to Martin Buber in 1916 during the height of World War I, asking Buber how he could be a Zionist, for surely the Zionist state would be as jingoistic and militaristic as Germany and Austria were during the war years. Buber's response came only after the war. And in it he wrote, surely you are right, but this is the project of the Jewish people in our generation, and I can't not be part of it. And Buber was able to get to Israel in 1933 and continued his illustrious career as one of the founding professors of the Hebrew University. Zweig moved to England, eventually to the US, and then eventually to Brazil, but he was really devastated by the destruction in Europe and died by suicide during the war. I would update Buber's response today, and this is what I used to talk about before this year, because people would say, how can you be a liberal, a leftist, and be a Zionist? And I would say to them, this is us. This is our family, and we have to be part of the family. We have to be part of the discussion. Israel is the project of the Jewish people in this age, and I can't not take part in it. I want to tell you a story before I go on with my prepared remarks. I want to tell you a story about a family who's living at Kibbutz Lotan. At Kibbutz Lotan, we absorbed we have two really beautiful stories. One, a family who used to live at Lotan moved to the northern border, Ariel and Noah. They lived at Lotan when their second daughter, Abigail, was born. And when Ariel was doing his internship as a psychologist. And they liked the community and we liked them, but they had to leave because Noah had to find an internship. There wasn't an internship available in our region. They went to a kibbutz near Kiryat Shmona, to Neot Mordechai. And they were there for 3 years. And then she finished her internship, and they were thinking about they weren't sure where they were going to move. And they came to Lotan on October 9th because they understood that where they were living was dangerous. And then and she was 9 months pregnant, and she came and she had her baby in Eilat and living on Lotan, and the community, of course, embraced them. And then they went back up to gather their things, and they moved to Lotan, and they're on track to become members of the kibbutz now. So that's wonderful. That's a wonderful story of somebody. They were kind of, maybe they were going to come to Lotan, and that was what decided it for them. The other story is a story of a family from the Otef region, from the Gaza region, from Moshav Ami Oz, which is right next to Kibbutz Kfar Aza. Yonit was born on the Moshav, and she lived there until she was in her 20s, and she moved to England, and she lived in England, and she married an Englishman, and they have a son. He's 7 years old, I think, and he's got some learning disabilities. And the father is English, and he doesn't speak Hebrew. He's been to Israel a few times. And Yonit was diagnosed with cancer. And in England, the National Health was not able to give her, to schedule her a beginning of treatment until December of this year, of 2023. So in August, she was already losing capacity, and she left England and came to Israel, where she knew that she would be able to get the health care that she needed. And she was living at her parents' house in the Moshav, and on October 7th, they were stuck in the safe room for, 20 hours, 24 hours, something like that. And they came with the autistic son. There were, I think, 3 or 4 people at Ami Oz were killed in the attack, and they succeeded in pushing the attackers away. And Yonit and her husband, they came to Lotan. She was in a wheelchair and going up to Beersheba for treatment on the bus. Thank God she's much better now, and she's actually working on Lotan. And we were able to. At first, they were there were 5 or 6 families from Ami Oz living in those same guest rooms that some of you stayed in. And now we've moved them into a house that is a family house. And they're the last family from Ami Oz still on the kibbutz, because we didn't have any available housing for them. And she's much better, and she's now working on the kibbutz, replacing a woman who's off on maternity leave. So that's a relief. Her parents are in their 80s. They have a farm, and they were not willing to evacuate. And they're living in their house in the Moshav and working their farm. And all the foreign workers left, and they're working their farm with volunteers, and they're not willing to leave. So they come down now and again, but they're still there. So what else can I tell you? Members of our kibbutz have been serving in reserve duty. We had a number of fathers who had to go with small children who had to go to reserve duty for several months. We have some members whose sons were called up for reserve duty. 2 of my kids' best friends spent, neither of them in Gaza, but in other parts, were in reserve duty. And one of them is going, because he's an officer, he's going back before Pesach. And we also have some sons who are in regular service, and daughters who are in regular service, 18, 20-year-olds. I haven't got a chance to speak with them. One of them is in the 55th Battalion of the Tzanchanim, of the paratroopers, which is like they're the point of the spear, as we say. And one of them is in the sappers, the ones who go into the tunnels to lay down the explosives in order to blow up the tunnels. So, he's been home a bit, but the other one has not been home hardly at all. Rabbi Sharon Brous from Los Angeles is one of my rabbinic heroes, and I quoted her probably several times over the years. She gave a beautiful sermon last Shabbat, in which she quotes an interview with Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli public intellectual. He says, if you look at the major conflicts and injustices in the world, it's ultimately about the stories we tell. He believes that what makes us humans unique is that we are a storytelling animal. Some people think that humans fight over the same things, the same reasons that animals fight over. Animals fight over territory, over food, maybe over mates. But humans, while we do occasionally fight about those things, we mostly fight about stories. Think about what's going on in Israel, in Palestine right now. There's enough land to build enough houses and hospitals and schools for everyone. There's enough food to feed everyone. We're fighting over imaginary stories that we hold very dear. Who is God's favorite? Who did God give this desert to? Most of the conflicts in the world are about this. And he says this is actually good news. Because if conflicts are about objective things, the only way to end them maybe is through violence. But if conflicts are about stories, there's a chance, in at least some cases, where we can change the story. We can find a common story that we can all be happy with. We need a new story. We need a story of redemption. And the question is, do we have the capacity to write it? So before I take questions, I'd like to ask you all to stand and let us do some of what we Jews do in synagogues, which is pray. I'd like you to stand if you are able, and we'll share some of the prayers that we say for the hostages. Achenu kol beit Yisrael, achiotenu kol beit Yisrael, הנתונים בצרה ושביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום יחם עליהם, יוצאים מצרה לרווחה, ואפלה לאורה, משעבוד לגאולה, השתה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ונאמר amen. For all our family, the house of Israel, fellow Jews who face anguish and captivity, whether on sea or on land, may the divine have compassion upon them and bring them from distress to relief, from darkness to light, from subjugation to redemption, now, speedily, soon. And let us say, Amen. Shirley Tzvat Davidai, who is a rabbinical student at HUC in Jerusalem, wrote this prayer for counting the days of captivity. L'shem yichud kudsha brichu u'shchintei b'tchilu urchimu. For the sake of the unification of the Holy One with the Shekhinah, in their judgment and in mercy, inenu muchanim u'muzmanim lekayem mitzvat aseh shel sfirat hayamim she'omdot lanu chovat mitzvat pidyon hachatufim v'chatufot. We hereby declare that we are prepared to commence the mitzvah of counting the days in which our obligations to the mitzvah of pidyon shvuim, of freeing the captives, have yet to be completed. Kamosha katuv, ufiduyei Adonai yeshuvun uva'u Tzion berina, v'simchat olam al rosham, sason v'simcha yasigun, nasu yagon va'anacha. As it is written, so let God's ransomed return. Let them come with shouting to Zion, crowned with joy everlasting. Let them attain joy and gladness while sorrow and sighing flee. Nivarech. Bruchim niyeh Yisrael al chovotenu u'mitzvatenu l'spor yom achar yom et shivyam. Ulekayem b'mehera mitzvat pidyon shvuim u'shvuyot. Let us bless. Blessed will be Israel for our obligations and our mitzvah to count day after day of their captivity, and may we speedily perform the mitzvah of redeeming the captives. Hayom 100 ו-58 יום לחטיפתם האכזרית מביתם, שהם 22 שבועות ו4 ימים למניין השבי. Today is 158 days since the violent kidnapping from their homes. That is 22 weeks and 4 days of a captivity. Yehi ratzon milfanenu, may it be our will, שבזכות ספירת הימים שספרנו היום, תהיה טובתם בליבנו ובלב ראשינו ויועצינו, ונפעל כולנו לפדיונם. May it be our will that with the merit of this counting of days that we have counted today, that the welfare of the hostages remain in our hearts and in the hearts of our leaders and their advisors, that we all act with commitment and determination and with pure intentions towards their redemption, until they return home in health and wholeness, speedily and in our days. And let us say, Amen. If you feel like you need to sit down, please sit down. You know, after the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yoshua went around the land of Israel. And he was visiting the communities that were in mourning. And he said to them, you can't spend your whole life in mourning. You must get up. And they said, but we are in mourning. What shall we do? He said, have a small tear in a garment. Leave a corner of your house unplastered. Keep some small reminder, but don't just stay in the place of despair. Because, and you know, maybe this is why the poem Hatikva by the very odd poet who wrote the poem Naftali Hertz Imber, but his poem became very popular in the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century until it became the theme song of the Zionist movement, and now is the national anthem with the small changes, the national anthem of Israel. And that Hatikva translates to the hope, because, and Imber himself was very depressed and ended his life a penniless drunkard. But he seemed in that one poem to really, to distill that feeling that we must take hope, and we must take hope as our flag. And the only way that we can take hope as our flag is to be hopeful, and even to fake it till we make it. And certainly, if we have a simcha, we should be celebrating our simcha. And if we have a mitzvah in the month of Adar to be happy, we should do our best to be happy in the month of Adar, and not be sad and depressed and only focused on destruction. One of the things that happens to us as we age, and this makes sense because as we age, we begin to know more and more people that we used to know are no longer with us. And we kind of move into that track of only thinking about the good old days and thinking about the people who were and are no longer. And that's important, and we should never forget them. On the other hand, we should not build our lives around them, right? Our people came out of slavery in Egypt, and the whole culture of Egypt was about only focusing on the dead. And we said, we're not going to be those people, we're going to focus on life. And so my final message is we must focus on life, and we must think about smachot, about joyful occasions, and we must be together in our joyful occasions and use all the tools that we have, whether as lawyers or as architects or as doctors, all the tools that we have as in community that we had as younger people in the world, don't give up on those tools, because those are the tools with which we can build community. And so I'd like to finish, as we finish every prayer, with a prayer for peace. With the Oseh Shalom Bimromav, U Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, and we'll add Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel. So the one who makes peace in heaven, make peace here on earth for all of Israel and for all who live on earth. And the melody, I hope you know, but it's a different melody than the one that perhaps you're familiar with. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, U Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imu, Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, U Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imu, Amen. Yalla la la la, yalla la la la, yalla la 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 la, yalla la 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 la, yalla la 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 la, yalla yalla la, yalla la 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 la, yalla la 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 la. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, U Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'imu, Amen. So if you have any questions, and if there are questions from the Zoom, I'd be glad to answer questions from the Zoom too. And I do want to say I'm a rabbi. I live in the very deepest south of Israel. I love to think about complex and philosophical questions, but I do have things to say about politics, as you heard, and I will hope not to get too deep into them.
Okay, so I'll avoid politics. First of all, Rabbi, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you again. And what a blessing indeed it is that your mother and father are 95 and 96 years old, respectively. Until Rabbi Julie did her introduction, I didn't realize you were living in that particular region of Israel. Our daughter spent part of her junior year on Keturah at the Arava Institute.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and she met some wonderful people there who became her friends, one of whom became her husband, as a matter of fact. But among the others were young Palestinians. This is before the Second Intifada. And she became very close to them and visited with them and their families and their homes. These were probably middle class or upper middle class people all of whom had the same hopes and dreams for their kids as we had for our kids. And we're sending them off to college, as a matter of fact. Now it's impossible to have a conversation with her about what's going on in Israel. Just impossible to have a conversation as she looks at the death and destruction on both sides. And when you speak about the redemption of the hostages, what is? I said I wasn't going to talk about politics.
No,
What
that's
is
fine,
what
that's
is
fine.
what is likely to be the political solution that brings that about?
If you know or if you have a clue, please call your senator, or if you have a connection with the guy who owns the last house out on Gordon's Pond Road, maybe you should call him directly, because we all want to know the answer to that question. I'll tell you that I think that one of the great difficulties is that, especially for those of us who are used to nation states behaving like nation states and following the Geneva Convention and following the international law. So you expect a nation state to behave like that, and Israel is a state that behaves like that, right? One of the grave concerns that stalled the judicial reform, which is not, it's stalled and moving much more slowly, nevertheless it is moving on. But one of the grave concerns about it was that one of the reasons that the international community did not take up the issue of Palestine for the past 50 years is because Israel has a robust judicial system. And that robust judicial system has in the past prosecuted people for war crimes and for acts of barbarity, Israelis, for acts of barbarity, right? We've been pushing a lot the story about sexual violence among the Hamas fighters on the 7th of October, but the fact is that Israelis also commit atrocities to our great dismay, but Israel has a military justice system and a civilian justice system that work and that have been used in cases where the commanders have overstepped the boundaries. The fact that the current coalition wants to take that apart is a bad thing for our neighbors, our family members, our children who are serving in that military. I sat on the plane on the way here. They put me in the exit row, and these two tall guys come sit down next to me, and I realized, looking at what they're studying, that they are Benjamin Netanyahu's personal pilots, training to use the plane. They're El Al pilots who are on their way to Paris to train to use the plane that Israel bought. That's now most airlines aren't using it, the 767. And I was like, oh boy, because I'm sure that they were also in Miluim quite a lot over the past few months, as most of the other men in their age group were. In the reserve, Miluim is reserve duty. So the answer to your question is that it's a political process, and the political process in Israel, just like in this country, is very messy. It's not at all clear what's happening. Just yesterday, there was a headline that Gideon Sa'ar has broken up what was being called the National Unity Party. There was, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but there was a party called National Unity that it's actually a faction made up of two parties, one called Tikva Chadasha and the other called Kahol Lavan. Kahol Lavan is Benny Gantz's party, and Tikva Chadasha is Gideon Sa'ar's party. Gideon Sa'ar left the Likud because he was the most likely candidate for the Likud to replace Netanyahu, but wasn't able to make that last step. Remember that Benjamin Netanyahu is in his mid-70s. So, but the Israeli Constitution, it's important to explain. The unwritten Constitution of the State of Israel says, the laws regarding the Knesset, and this was the mid-2000s, the government, even if a majority of members of Knesset vote to topple the government doesn't fall, and elections are not called unless there is what's called constructive constructive vote of no confidence, right? That means that they have to create a government, like a coalition of at least 61 members. Okay, but Gideon Sa'ar splitting that 16-member contingent into two 8-member contingents means that there's things look less certain that might happen. But for that to happen, the party on the farthest left of the coalition is the Likud. And they are famously not breaking up anymore. The people who would leave have left, and the people who are members of that faction are not leaving. On the other hand, the Shas party has been indicating, and they did very well in local elections that were held a few weeks ago. And so the Shas party might jump ship. But who knows? And that's the only way that the elections are going to happen before 2026. And that's in order that there be a government that's willing to negotiate with the Hamas. Now, it's not that they're not negotiating with the Hamas now. They're negotiating the release of the hostages. But Hamas are not moving on their position, according to the information we get from that in Israel, the Israeli press gets. The Hamas are not moving their position. Now, one of the problems in the Jewish community is that when people call for a ceasefire, I said nation states, right? Hamas in particular, the Palestinian Authority is, and this is also important to understand, the Palestinian Authority is a rogue government. Okay? The Fatah lost the election in 2006, Hamas won. But in the West Bank, the Fatah just kicked out all the Hamas people. And in the Gaza Strip, the Hamas kicked out all the Fatah people. Okay, so democracy might not be the solution at the moment. But what will certainly be a solution is to stop weakening the part of the Palestinian leadership who are willing to abide by international law. And that is the Palestinian Authority and not the Hamas. The Hamas will not follow international law, will not follow Geneva Conventions. Maybe they have their own, what they think are excuses, but the rest of the world doesn't think it's an excuse, right? And they're terrorists, right? And Israel is negotiating with them. So, okay, now that's the political solution. Now your family. I can't tell you what to do in your family, but I would be glad to speak to you about your daughter because my wife is the associate director of the Arava Institute. But what I do want to say is this. In our families, we must find ways to talk to each other. We must listen to our children. They are inheriting the world. We must find ways. The Pesach Seder, on the Shabbat before Pesach, we read in the book of Malachi, we read, I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet, and he will turn the hearts of the sons toward the fathers and the fathers towards the sons. We must turn our hearts towards our children. We must listen to them, and we must demand that they also listen to us. They're thinking about different things, they're seeing different dangers, and one of the things that most of our children, especially those who studied at the Arava Institute, they are saying, you brought me up with strong Jewish values. You brought me up with strong Jewish values that say we should be honorable people, we should be caring people, we should be taking care of the sick and the widows and the orphans, and we should not be carpet bombing the neighbors. And it's hard to argue with that from the position of morality, of the civilian morality. There are military explanations for what was done. Some of them make sense, some of them make less sense for civilians, and as civilians we must think like civilians and not think like military people, because a military solution is not going to be anyone's solution. A military solution leads to all of us dying.
So, someday the war will end, I hope. So has the Israeli government developed a plan on what's going to happen after that and what goes on next?
I don't know. I'm not a spokesman for the Likud party, as you can hear. That I'm not I'm not part of their coalition, so I don't know. I'm sure that my colleague, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who is a member of Knesset and one of the leaders the Labor Party in the Knesset and of the opposition would give you a much longer answer. I have the luxury of being a rabbi and not a politician, and so I don't know the answer, and I have not heard the plans. I have heard individual members of the government talking about things that would better not be talked about, like building Jewish settlements again in Gaza.
I have a quick question. You mentioned the Palestine Authority. I could swear I recently read that the leadership had stepped down.
No, it's not exactly that. The government resigned, okay, and Abbas accepted their resignation, but asked them to stay on as caretaker government. And from what I understand, this is so people who are more acceptable to the Israelis, more acceptable to the Americans, more acceptable to the international community can join that government and join and so that they, because they have a constitution too. I said they're a rogue government, but they're behaving like a country, right? When I say they're a rogue government, I mean the people who won the election said, we're not going to follow international law, and the people who were the caretaker government said, that's not how things work around here. And that should be the way that all our countries work, right? Including this one. But I gather that there's still some disagreement about that in this country too, right?
I'm concerned very much what's going on in Gaza. I personally think that it's rather horrible to hear about killing 30,000 people in Gaza and the possibility that Israel may want to stay and continue and occupy Gaza. And what's your views on this?
I pretty much agree with you. It's important that you understand that in Israel, our media has been under attack by the current government in many ways, as your media has too. Not just, I mean, when I say under attack, it's not an overt attack. In Israel, it's more overt than it is in this country, right? But in this country, you have still pretty much a fair media, but you have a team, one company that calls themselves Fair and Balanced, and since everyone lifted the fairness doctrine, things have gotten really out of balance, especially that particular company, right? And there's other companies that are even more extreme, I gather, in your media here. So the Israeli media is even more like that than the media here is. And the Israeli public media is not being. Last night I heard two talks at the Reform Rabbinical Association meeting, one from David Saperstein and one from Orly Erez-Lechovsky. She's the director of the Israel Reform Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement. And she said that might be, the past 2 weeks, it's been changing a little bit. I've noticed it too. I read Haaretz, which is the left-wing newspaper, so I'm not sure how much I'm seeing what's happening on TV, because I just try not to watch TV. Okay, but the Israeli media mostly tells us stories about our soldiers and about what's going on in the home front in our country, and not so much what's going on in the home front in Gaza. But I gather that your media is telling you a little bit more about what's happening, and I have heard a couple pieces on NPR which are really heartbreaking and frightening. I do know this, that my wife, who's the associate director of the Arava Institute, as I said, has a colleague who works with the Arava Institute who's from Ramallah, and she went to visit family in the beginning of October. She went to visit family from the West Bank to Gaza, and she has been stuck in Gaza ever since. And so she's hearing a little bit about what's happening there. They also have alumni from Gaza and students they have even a student who was from Gaza who was in Israel on the 7th of October. right? There were 300,000 Palestinian workers from Gaza, 300,000, yeah, in Israel on the 7th of October. Most of those people were not Hamas active members, right? The vast majority of them. They were workers. They were farm workers, they were construction workers, and some of them were more professional workers. It's a real problem because we have a lack of low wage. We have a lack of people who are willing to work in low wage jobs. And Palestinians were the go-to people for that job until, and so they were increasing the numbers from Gaza. In our kibbutz, we were supposed to have employees from Jordan, most of the Jordanian population are Palestinians. They were supposed to be working in Israel, and they're not because there's security concerns. But those 300,000 people and those students, those Arava Institute graduates, those people, they had to stay in Israel. Some of them were imprisoned and were only released back to Gaza recently, and some of them were not. And you know, it's a terrible situation what's going on in Gaza. Apparently, the military tells us there was no other solution. Other people's militaries might say differently, but like we said, a military solution was not going to be a solution for anyone. And I think that Yehia Sinwar is very happy that Israel carpet bombed Gaza because it very quickly turned the public sentiment in the world in what I consider the wrong direction.
What role do you feel Egypt has in this?
I'm hoping that Egypt and Jordan and the countries that the Arab states from the Gulf who have already developed relationships with Israel are going to be the leaders of some multinational Arab force that's going to be a peacekeeper in Gaza. None of them want the Muslim Brotherhood either, right?
Why
Hamas is the
should
Muslim Brotherhood.
Israel take care of them? The people
First of all, our tradition teaches us that we should have mercy on our enemies. The sound of the shofar is likened to a cry, and the cry that it is likened to is the mother of Sisera. He was the general, not the enlisted soldier. We should be compassionate. We call ourselves Rahmanim b'nei Rahmanim, the compassionate children of the compassionate. And if we cannot be compassionate with our enemies, then nobody can. And we are only 16 million people in the world. There's 2.1 billion Muslims. If numbers and, you know, if we were only fighting, we would be dead. And I don't want to be dead. And I don't think the Jewish people want to be dead. I think the Jewish people have a role to play, and I don't think that the way that we're doing it right now is the best way to do it. But like I said, I might be wrong.
Maybe I'll let myself ask the last question, then people can continue to ask you downstairs.
Great.
And then that is, what do you think is, because you made me think, do you see as a role for American Jews? How can we support people like you? How can we support that vision when there's so much hatred of Israel that any critique comes across as, you know, supporting the haters of Israel and et cetera? So what kind of things can we do besides we have a congregant speaking on Friday night who went and volunteered on farms, but what kind of things could we do?
So some of the things that you can do from here is read the fine print. Don't just, first of all, give tzedakah. Tzedakah means that's the money that you give without asking where it's going. But also give donations thoughtfully, and don't just give to everyone who comes to look for people who are espousing the same values you espouse. In your home, what you espouse here, that you want to espouse there. I mentioned earlier something about the civil society taking over where where governments should be taking the role. many of the organizations that like to raise money do so in ways that I consider unethical. There was a story in Haaretz very soon after October 7th with a photograph of workers from the Zaka organization. Zaka is a wonderful organization. They do tremendously important work, taking care of the bodies of the dead in all kinds of situations, accidents and natural disasters and man-made disasters. But these people were photographed and there was a body bag with a body in it next to their picnic table. And when asked why they were doing that and wasn't that disrespectful, they didn't really have a good answer. The government is supposed to provide, right? Your government provides every need of the U.S. military, right? They provide all kinds of tax benefits as well. I was in line at a hotel, very fancy hotel in Philadelphia this morning, and in front of me there was a soldier, and he had a form in his hand that was a tax exemption form that he needed the hotel to, to attach to the bill so that they wouldn't charge him the local taxes. There's no reason that civilians should be providing money for military people. If on October 7th there were issues, just as there were in previous wars when mass numbers of soldiers are called up, there's always issues with supplies and equipment, and the emergency supplies are never in good shape, but that's not a reason why civilians should be providing money. My friend whose son is in the engineering corps, the parents group of their platoon is like, it's like suburban high school parents.
PTO.
Like a PTA, and they're like, you didn't bring your son, you need to go to this store and buy this kind of night vision goggles. That's crazy. Why are the parents providing night vision goggles? Maybe they should be if they should be provided, they should be providing, nice things for their rec room, right? But they don't need to be providing tactical equipment. So excuse me if I'm kind of digging into somebody's favorite charity, but I really don't think those are the organizations to donate to. I think that one of the places that you can donate it is to organizations that express your values. Your friends in the middle of the room mentioned the Arava Institute. I have an interest. My wife is the associate director. It's a wonderful organization. They've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. They work with Israelis and Palestinians. They have a plan. The government hasn't published a plan, but they have a plan for the day after for their area of interest, which is environmental issues, which, as you can imagine, after a situation like there is in Gaza right now, environmental issues are very high on the list because it's hygiene and it's survival. Another organization is the Reform Movement. We also provide our Karen Bekavod, our Tzedakah arm, set up spaces in Eilat to help the people who were evacuated to Eilat, who were living in the hotels, and we had more than 100 volunteers who were working in Eilat. So that's another organization that I recommend donating to, and I can provide more. But really, what I'm saying is, read the fine print and find the organizations that are expressing your values. And values, check your values. Are you saying the same thing about what's going on here in America as you're saying about what's going on over there? It's very important, because we should always be consistent with ourselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you to Larry Krever, who's, I think, watching on Zoom, our president, and Howie for helping make this possible, and thank you, Anita. and Carol for helping out, and the Adult Education Committee with Susan and Enid and everybody for helping out. And please, we're going to meet you downstairs with a reception, and you can ask more questions there. Okay.
Thank you.